Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Apologies for the delay. I think we're going to get going sharing it this way. So I'm Ruchi Regan. I am the Rabbinic Disability Scholar in Residence at Matan. And what I do is think about rabbinic knowledge, disability community knowledge from a number of angles and try and get us out of the silos and solve some problems on the ground. So today we're going to talk about disability tips for camps and conferences and how we can make immersive environments a better experience for participants with disabilities, which is an issue for both staff and campers, mostly going to focus on campers today, but it's worth keeping in mind that this is a consideration for both populations. So, okay, the key thing here, I think, is Hillel's golden rule. That which is hateful to you, do not do to others. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn it. Principle easily stated, not easily practiced, which is why the part I like to emphasize is the now go and learn it part. We know that certain things are hateful, but we can't avoid doing them just by knowing that it's not nice to be mean. We have to be mindful about not doing hateful things to others. Think about what they are and think about how we really act on this in principle and create an environment that we'd want to be in. So I think one principle of not doing what is hateful to us is really nobody likes to be surrounded by people who are trying to fix them. It's not a pleasant experience to be told that the way you are in the world is wrong, everything you're doing is wrong. And that's the experience that kids with disabilities and to a similar extent, staff with disabilities tend to have. And I think that one thing we can keep in mind that can be very helpful is to distinguish between camp and therapy. Camp is not therapy, and accommodating campers and staff with disabilities in camp is not about treating disability or causing some sort of improvement or overcoming. Camp is about positive Jewish experiences, about learning, about doing Jewish things that are worth doing, about developing your own personal Jewish identity in a community that's maybe shared but also separate from the one that happens in your home because you're a separate person. And camp does all of those things and more things. But what it doesn't do is treat disability or make people into someone else. However we accommodate and however we build space, campers and staff who have disabilities stay disabled and their disabilities stay important. They don't overcome them. The point is that they're Jews with disabilities. They're part of the community. We need to treat people as equals. And our accessibility thinking is about acting on our belief that all people are created equal and all Jews are fully Jewish. It's not about fixing disability. It's not about overcoming. It's about building a community that has space for all of our people. So in line with that, this do not do what is hateful to you. Nobody likes to be subjected to arbitrary rules. And there's often a lot of really arbitrary rules in camp. And they're not very pleasant for anyone, but they tend to cause much bigger problems for campers and staff with disabilities. Because if there's a rule, say, that you can't go back to your cabin during the day, that's going to be humiliating and unpleasant for any campers at some point. But it's going to be a much bigger problem for kids with, say, ADHD who really can't remember consistently to bring what they need and really need support on a daily basis and being able to go back for their stuff. And I think in camp, there usually is the staff ratio to support it, but there isn't always the belief that it's an appropriate form of support. And I think that empathy and just thinking about which rules are necessary, which rules are arbitrary, and if things are upsetting on a regular basis, whether there's room to change them and to solve the problem the rule is intended to solve in a different way. So in particular, nobody likes to be humiliated for making mistakes. And I think campers, again, with and without disabilities, tend to experience this a lot in camp, but it's an order of magnitude higher for kids with disabilities. Because if you're the one who's always failing to follow the rule and always getting called out for it, and everyone knows that you specifically are the person whose staff are frustrated with, that sets things up for a different kind of humiliation, exclusion, and unpleasantness. So I think we need to really set expectations about, presuming goodwill, solving problems that are solvable, not being punitive, and not saying things like, I shouldn't have to tell you this, you're a baby. Because if there's an ongoing problem, again, if a rule is leading to constant conflict and people are unhappy and frustrated, often the issue isn't how to get the kids to follow the rules. Often the issue is how do we have empathy, think about the problem in a different way, and create rules that are more appropriate to the people and circumstances we're dealing with. Guys, one example is that camps usually have sufficient staff ratio such that even if kids can't go alone to get something from their bunk, there really is ratio to support that. It's just a matter of remembering that it's appropriate, necessary, not a big deal, because we all forget things and nobody likes to be humiliated for doing a very human thing. Similarly, I've seen a lot of power struggles over food in camp that were really ultimately unnecessary. And I know this because when I've worked in camp in positions involving food, I've seen that kids have very similar issues, but whether it's a problem depends entirely over whether their counselor decides to make a power struggle over it. For instance, if there's cereal readily available, camp has it, it's not a problem to provide it. There isn't really any good reason to decide that kids have to eat pizza instead of cereal because, it's bread and milk. And if they're eating and they're getting their nutritional needs met and it's not really a burden on staff time, there's no problem with solving the problem in the way that we would all want to be treated, where there's no reason to arbitrarily deny people things that are easily available without causing a problem. Along similar lines, no one likes to have their feelings invalidated, and kids who have a hard time in camp or struggle tend to face a lot of invalidation because we have this identity that camp is a fun place and these activities are great, and that if people just try, they'll be happy. A lot of times that's not true. And if we're having a hard time with something, the most hateful thing to experience as often is, oh, that's easy. Because if it's hard for me, it's hard. If it's hard for a kid, it's hard. If it's hard for staff, it's hard. And telling people that something is easy and fun when their experience is that it's hard and making them unhappy is really invalidating. Similarly, saying, if somebody's really being miserable about something and you say this is the best part of camp, then if they believe you, they're really going to expect to not have a good time, and it just sets everything up for adversarial. So if we start with the presumption that if kids are having a hard time and they're unhappy, it's because there's a real problem, and we come to a position of people's feelings are valid and need to be handled constructively, that alone, empathy doesn't require a higher staff ratio or more money. It just requires that we realize that kids are fully human even when they're difficult, and that they have feelings and that their feelings are important and they have their reasons. And we really can take a constructive, collaborative problem-solving approach. And doing it that way makes a huge difference. Making expectations clear with staff about doing it that way also makes a really big difference. So again, there are a lot of reasons why camp, encampment, conferences can be really hard on kids and staff with disabilities. Because it wasn't designed with them in mind. For a long time, most campers with disabilities were not welcome in camp, which means that these activities we have were planned around the needs of a very narrow range of people. And it means that when people are coming in who were previously excluded, being present doesn't in and of itself undo all of the exclusion. It's a first step, but you also come across all of these barriers, subtle and blatant, of being in an environment that's designed with the assumption that you're not the kind of person who belongs there. And I think we all have very good intentions about fixing that problem. And I think that we've done a lot of good work towards making it better. But part of making it better is holding emotionally the fact that it's still a very difficult situation for a lot of people. And they have the feeling, they're going to have feelings about that. And they're going to have hard days and they're going to have struggles. We need to anticipate that and have empathy and let people feel the way they feel. So, and I think that one thing that we need to stop doing is we need to not make rules like have fun. Have fun should not be a rule. Kids should not be expected to praise camp and talk about how great it is. And this came out of a conversation I had with some kids. It was actually at BBYO. There's an activity I do that's an accessibility scavenger hunt where we examine the environment to look at various access issues. And one of the things I have on the list is a rule that can make things less accessible. One of the kids, a teenager who was doing this activity with me, said have fun is a rule that causes problems. And we talked about why. And the reason have fun rules can cause really big accessibility problems is that if you're going into an environment that's not really fully accessible, not planned with you in mind, you're going to face a lot of times where you're not having fun. And if you're also facing a rule that says you're supposed to be having fun, it makes it really hard to say, you know, this is a problem and I would like to solve it. And it also makes it really hard to feel like you're welcome there if the expectation is that you be having fun and be happy at all times. And I know that in some sense these rules aren't necessarily meant totally literally, but they're experienced literally a large percentage of the time by a lot of people. So I think that if we don't have rules like have fun, either explicit or implicit, and we don't make kids sing a song about how great camp is, it can really create a better environment for people who are being very brave to be in an environment where they know they're going to face days that are difficult, they know they're going to be excluded from stuff, and they know they're going to face pain and humiliation. That's brave, and we need to support that and respect it and not gloss over it. And again, subtle, but really impactful. So another part of this is that nobody likes to spend all day doing activities they hate. And a lot of camp activities are really not fun for some people. Like sometimes camp is designed such that people spend the whole day in very intensely socially demanding, loud, fast-paced activities. And for some people that's great, and for some people it's miserable. And making room for people who that works for, people who it doesn't work for, and people who it works for in small doses is something that can really make camp better for everyone, but can also make camp possible for kids with disabilities and for some staff. Similarly, Nobody likes to spend all day failing at things. And right now, that's the experience a lot of kids with disabilities are having, because the activities are designed in a way that assumes that they can do things that they can't do or can't do readily or can't do without a lot of really unpleasant, intense effort. Like large group socialization, arts and crafts activities, sports activities, if there's no sports options that work with your motor skills, cognitive skills, social skills. And kids really need to have the experience in camp of doing activities which can be enjoyable, successful, and make them feel like they're valued and valuable. And to just hold that not everyone's the same, and it's really okay to be different. And sometimes we send the message that it's okay to be different, and sometimes we send the message that it's not. That can manifest in a number of ways, like just with kids with different interests and inclinations, kids with disabilities of various kinds, kids who, may be, not heterosexual or questioning their gender or trying to figure that out. And creating a space where we're not trying to make everyone the same. We're trying to say it's okay to be different, and this is a community where we want to create space for everyone, is something that matters. And part of what that means is that we need to let go of a certain iconic camp experience where this platonic ideal of camp things people should do, because iconic camp things are great for a lot of people. And a lot of them are really miserable for a lot of people. And it's not okay if people are spending a lot of their time being miserable. And it doesn't have to be that way. It is okay if not everyone sings the camp song, or if some people would rather read books than participate in trivia night or a relay race or something. And it's really okay if campfire is this great, wonderful experience for some people and they make s'mores and it's awesome, but some people find the texture of marshmallows disgusting, they don't like the smoke, and they sit on the side and hang out with their friends and talk about other stuff. That's not failure. It's successful differentiation and making room for people to be different from each other, because we're different and it's okay. And we have the staff ratios to make room for difference if we plan for it and if we treat it as appropriate and necessary. So keeping in mind, making room for difference means keeping in mind that in order to be fully inclusive, it's not just about finding the right supports. It's also about navigating ways in which camp needs to change. So it can be an area, a place in which everybody is welcome, expected, planned for, and able to be valued and valuable to the community. One really powerful way to do this, which I think is a direction that camps have been shifting in for other reasons, is that incorporating more choice into the schedule. Because when campers have choices, it really makes it a better experience for everyone, because people have a better experience when they do things that they enjoy, when they do things they care about, and when they can do things they can be successful about. So thinking about where can we incorporate more choices and offer a broader range of activities, because you can, with the same staff ratio for a large group activity, you can have multiple medium or small group activities. And thinking about like more hugim periods, more choices in bunk and group activities, and maybe ongoing daily choice periods where kids can pick their activities on an ongoing fluid basis. And a lot of camps are implementing this very successfully, again, because it's good for everyone and it's crucial for kids with disabilities. Because not every option can work for everyone, and having options that will work for you can really make a huge difference. So people have better experiences when they do things that they care about, and making space for that shows people that we care about them. It's also important as a way to facilitate social inclusion. It's one of the things we get asked about the most is like, these are great accommodations for participation, but kids aren't making friends with each other. What do we do about that? And one of the things that can really help with that is offering choices and allowing kids to spend as much time as possible doing things they care about and are interested in. And there's a couple of reasons why this can be a really powerful way to facilitate social inclusion. It's really because inclusive ideology does not make friendships. Nothing we lecture kids about in terms of being friends with each other can cause them to be friends, but what does build friendships is shared experiences and shared interests that really send the message we're all in this together. So that's one reason. Another reason is that if you have kids in a place they don't want to be doing something they don't want to do, they're going to feel frustrated and resentful, and they're likely to take it out on someone. And if you have an activity where a lot of people are unhappy and the kids with disabilities are repeatedly failing, that's a situation that sets people up to encourage and expect bullying. So if we move away from that and as much as possible create a model where campers, kids, teen leaders, whoever, are spending as much time as possible doing things they like and being places they want to be, it's a really powerful way to facilitate social inclusion in and of itself, even without disability-specific planning or considerations. That alone can really make a difference for a lot of kids with disabilities. That said, if we plan for access and for what the needs of campers are when we're thinking about what activities to offer, that can make an even bigger difference, because if we're very careful and intentional about the range of choices, we can make sure that we can increase the success rate of giving kids access to activities that they will care about, enjoy, and be able to do successfully together. So if you think about who the campers are, who the campers might be, what are they interested in? What can't they do? What can they do? What's going to be fun? What's going to be frustrating? What's the range of activities offered? And is it likely that there's something that's going to work for every camper? And again, this can be with the same number of activities you'd otherwise offer. Doesn't need to necessarily be more staff or more activities. Just thinking about what the activities are, why, and how to make them work for more people. So there's another example, but like a lot of medications that are pretty common for ADHD or for psychiatric issues cause heat sensitivity as a side effect, which can make it really hard to do outdoor activities in hot weather. So thinking about, are there indoor options that are going to work for people who are heat sensitive and who are just totally derailed by the weather? Are there activities that are highly social and activities that are not? Because again, some people are extroverted, some people are not. And we're all together in Jewish community, whether we're intensely interacting or whether we're just kind of together. And so making space for it to be okay if someone would rather talk to one person, do chavruta, or read a book by themselves in a room with other people, work on crafts together, work separately. You know, all of those things are okay. None of them are failures of community. And we need to make space for all of them, because if we have space for all of them, then people with that range of social needs can be successful in camp and make friends and, you know, be happy. Similarly, thinking about motor skills when we're thinking about the range of activities, because a lot of things that don't seem difficult to people with typical motor skills are totally derailing to people who do not have typical motor skills. So just thinking about what's the range of activities, what's likely to work and not work for people with limited motor skills. Similarly, if there are blind campers, are there activities that don't depend on vision? You know, some kids are really academically inclined and intellectual, like to engage in that in summer. Some kids see summer as like a much needed break from that. Offering both kinds of activities in the same period, in the same activity period, can really accommodate more people. And again, doesn't necessarily require more staff or more activities, just thinking about what are the range of needs and in this particular period with the range of planned activities, is it likely that there's going to be options that work well for everyone? Like a caveat about that, don't place kids in activities based on what you think they need. That tends to end in like in problematic experiences, social relatedness. Like if kids want to do hard, challenging things that aren't what we think would be the best choice, like let them, because that's the experience of deciding to challenge themselves and deciding what they want can be a really important one. So plan for a range of activities based on perceived needs, but also respect kids about what they perceive their needs and preferences to be. And this is particularly important in sport, as I've seen camp situations in which all of the sports activities available are team sports or require like very high social demands or require skills not everyone may have, or they may all be outdoors, which isn't going to work for kids who are on medications that cause heat intolerance, especially when they're exercising with heat intolerance. So one thing that can really be important to make camp work well for more people is to think about what the sport options are. Are there things that are indoors and things that are outdoors? Are there activities that are and aren't team activities? Thinking about offering easy activities isn't the solution, because easy activities can still be hard for some kids. And actually, if we're expecting them to be easy, that can mean often that there's no plan for supporting kids who don't find them easy. So thinking about what works for kids with a range of motor skills, what works for kids who do and don't like intense socialization, what will work for kids who want to be doing something together, but for whom team sports aren't going to work because their physical abilities don't work for team sports in that way. And a couple of good options are karate and jump rope. Because karate is a shared group experience, but it's one that if you have good instructors can work for kids and people with a range of different abilities to pick it up. You can differentiate that. Jump rope similarly is a nice form of exercise. It's one that can be done indoors readily. It's one that you can do with group stuff. You can also do with individual stuff. It's one that really can be differentiated, and it's a good one to consider offering. It's also one that doesn't require expensive equipment or complicated space. So again, yom sport options. If you have color war or that kind of activity, and most camps do, great activity for some kids, really miserable for others. Not everyone wants to wake up and fight a war. And if people don't want to fight a war, we shouldn't make them. And cheers in conflict are really fun for some kids, completely terrifying and unpleasant for others, especially kids who have experienced trauma or are highly anxious or who are experiencing bullying are not necessarily going to think that color war is a game. They're going to experience this conflict language often as a real threat. And so allowing for neutrality can really help people to have a better experience. And when we allow for neutrality, it can't just be like sit it out. It can be like, one way of doing it is, okay, you're on the neutral team, and the neutral team is going to help prepare the celebration for the end. Or the neutral team is going to build something or make banners or something, like giving people a way. People who don't want to fight a war should have a way of opting out, having that be respected, and having something else to do that's like valuable, special, and planned for. Another thing that can happen on Yom Sport, Color War Day, is a lot of times, since people are yelling all day, there's a silent lunch that, encourages voice resting and is kind of, an iconic camp experience. It's fun for a lot of people. Some people really need to know how they can communicate if they need to, and need to make sure that there's always a way to do it. So one way you can do it is you can make a hand signal, like a timeout hand signal as a way for participants to signal, no, I really need to talk to you. I need you to listen to me. Don't dock me points for this. Another way you can do it is by setting up, like maybe in the corner, a sign that says communication zone, talking zone. So if people really need to say something and be understood, they can go there and somebody will know that it needs to be taken seriously. But there needs to be a plan for how people can communicate during silent lunch or silent dinner or wherever. And it needs to be explicit, and it needs to be clear that it's not a failure and there's nothing wrong with that, because communication is important and we value everyone's need to communicate about important things. And so just, those are some about choices, but more generally, planning for troubleshooting and budgeting staff time for troubleshooting is a crucial element of successful accessibility, because we're not going to be able to plan every access issue in advance because we don't know how. Like the knowledge of how to make camp accessible for everyone, we know some things, but we don't know everything we need to know yet. And there's going to be mistakes, there's going to be unanticipated things. And since we know that will happen, one thing that we do know is that we need to have a plan in place for accessibility troubleshooting, accessibility thinking and planning. Part of this and part of the fundamental troubleshooting approach is presume good faith when kids are having trouble. Kids who are difficult are usually difficult because they're having a hard time. It can feel personal, but it's really important to get in the habit of not taking it personally and not escalating it into a personal conflict. Again, like we have a principle of, in Judaism, we want to judge people favorably and not err on the side of this is a bad kid, he's, he or she is just being trouble. Starting with the presumption that this is a kid who is having a really hard time and they need help and there's a problem here and there's a solution. And as the adults, we need to be proactive about finding the solution, even if it's really frustrating. One thing to be aware of in that regard is that kids in general and boys in particular often figure out that looking like they can't do something makes them look stupid. Looking like they're being naughty and defiant makes them look normal. And it might make people angry, but it won't make people think they're broken. And so keeping in mind that even when kids seem to be intentionally misbehaving, it's often not really a behavior problem. It's often really they're having a really hard time and they're scared problem. Starting with the presumption of presuming good faith, presuming that there's a solution, and presuming this is not a bad kid, this is a kid who's having a really hard time, makes a lot of problems much more solvable. And again, part of taking a troubleshooting approach successfully is making the expectations very clear during staff week that accessibility troubleshooting is part of their job and being kind to kids who are having a hard time is part of their job. If an activity isn't working because it's not working for a kid, that is not a kid interfering with your job. Accessibility troubleshooting is not a distraction from your job. It's a core part of your job, and it is a core expression of our Jewish value that everybody is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that all Israel are responsible for one another. And there isn't an except disabled people clause in that. Like, this is part of your job. Expect it to be part of your job. Don't resent it as a distraction. And while accessibility is part of everybody's job and needs to be an expected part of everyone's job, some things happen much more readily if we designate specific people to serve those roles. And this is particularly important in situations where breakdowns are common. So like at meals, at large group activities, on trip days, and any time the regular flow of activities will be disrupted, it's really helpful to have people in some specific accessibility roles to take responsibility for making certain things happen. And there's 3 roles that I think are worth having. I think there should be an accessibility planner, an accessibility troubleshooter, and a break facilitator, as often as possible, as consistent as possible. Now, the accessibility planner's role is when you're planning an activity or a trip or something like that, the accessibility planner is the point person for thinking about access, for making sure that access problems get solved, for checking in with everyone else involved, and for being the buck stops here point person that other people know who to go to. The other thing the accessibility planner does is after the activity, they debrief with people involved about what worked, what didn't, what were the problems, what they implemented effective, and they make notes about that so they or whoever the next access planner can plan for those things in the next access. And if you have regular staff meetings, it's good to have the access planners report about what they observed and what worked and what didn't at staff meetings. So to give an example of one role the accessibility planner might be in, so say there's a 7th and 8th grade joint trip. So I decide Sarah, who's the Roche Dye unit head for the 7th graders, will be the designated access planner for this particular trip day. And now like one of the campers, say maybe one of the 8th graders is a wheelchair user. And so part of what Sarah does is check in about on the level of when we're deciding where to go, how do we know that the sites we've chosen are wheelchair accessible, have accessible bathrooms, and that the parts of the site we'll be using will include the kids who are wheelchair users? How do we make sure that the buses we're renting have a wheelchair lift? And what's our backup plan if the company flakes, which is a common occurrence? Sarah also verifies that there will be appropriate food available for kids with dietary needs, including treats. And so a camper, knowing that Sarah is the access person, goes to her and says, I have a really low noise tolerance. I know if we spend all day in loud, yelly, screamy environments, I'm going to have a meltdown. It will be terrible. Can you help figure out how I'll have access to quiet space? And, Sarah might, figure out a plan for that and may also say, some people find fidgets or stim toys really helpful in managing overload, or maybe you'd like to bring some headphones too. And, maybe that suggestion will be taken, maybe it won't, but it's part of being the accessibility planner is you kind of have a bird's eye view of all the access stuff. Or say maybe a counselor knows that their campers get really anxious if they don't know what's coming next. So they ask Sarah to make sure that there will be a clear written schedule they can give to them, or maybe a visual schedule if there's kids in their group who benefit from that. And it's there's all these moving parts, and they happen much more specific, much more reliably if it's a specific identifiable person's job to be the point person and pay attention to what's happening. So that's the accessibility planner role. I also think it's worth having an accessibility floater role, especially in group activities, large group activities, but it's worth having really anytime there's something in motion with a lot of moving parts. So what the accessibility floater does is they troubleshoot access issues during the activity or trip or meal or whatever's going on. Their role is to be proactive about watching for and troubleshooting access problems. And the accessibility floater should not have another role at the time. They should be exclusively focused on paying attention to and fixing access issues so that they can do that without it disrupting the activity. This makes a lot of things possible. And again, everyone involved needs to know who this person is. It can help to have like an accessibility floater sash or something so that it's clear who to go to. Sometimes the accessibility floater is the accessibility planner. Sometimes it's not. If they're not the planner, they should have communicated with the planner and be able to ask the planners questions. You know, depending on your camp, in some situations it might make sense for there to be a consistent designated access floater at some points. It may make more sense in some contexts for it to be a floating role, but it's really helpful and it makes a lot of things possible. So to give some examples of what an accessibility floater might do. So say there's 5th grade tefillah. David's a bunk counselor for one of the boys' bunks, the 5th grader boys' bunks. And he's the accessibility floater for the, whole unit 5th grade tefillah this week, the prayers for the 5th graders. And there's a camper, Ben, who has dyslexia and who it's been decided that at this point anyway, they're not going to work on Hebrew decoding, and that the most appropriate way for him to access prayer in Hebrew is to have access to transliteration. And so maybe David's paying attention to whether when the Sidurim are handed out, Ben actually gets access to his Sidur, where it is, and if he needs someone to get it for him. Or, so say maybe another thing happens, and this is common, say that maybe one of the Mishlachat, maybe one of the Israelis is teaching a new prayer or a new song that's not in the Sidur, and they forget that they're supposed to transliterate stuff for him. I can guarantee you this happens a lot. So David will notice, like, wait a minute, Ben doesn't have one. So could do various things to solve the problem, like Google and see if he can find a transliterated version quickly, or if he can do it himself in time. If he can't, David could apologize to Ben and say, this shouldn't have happened. I'm sorry that it did. And I'll get it for you for tomorrow or for later if this is going to be repeated. And I'll talk to the people and remind them that they're supposed to transliterate, and then David makes sure that he actually follows up and makes it happen. And again, this can take some creativity, effort, and focus in the moment, which is why this really needs to be a dedicated role when activities with a lot of moving parts are happening, because if it's not, they're not going to be able to put this kind of focus because they're going to have to do something else. Another thing that David can do is, because Ben is likely to be upset and humiliated about this, because it's hard to not be able to do things in the expected way. And it's really hard when people know about your access needs and don't bother to meet them or don't remember it. Sends a message that you're not valued. So part of what the access floater's role can be in these kinds of situations is to provide emotional validation and help to remind kids that it's not their fault. It's not because they have a disability, and this was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened, and you belong here, and and we'll work on it. Because kids with disabilities experience really painful mistakes on a regular basis, and very few people ever apologize to them for it. And when they're told that they're not the problem, and when things actually get solved, and when promises of access are kept, and when promises of fixing things are kept, it really makes a big difference to how they see themselves, how they see the Jewish community, and how other people treat them. So another example of what might happen, what an accessibility floater might do. So say, in a lot of camps, say the specialists all have a day off on, say, Wednesday, and often the bunk counselors will plan, a theme day with various activities. And one that I've seen a lot of camps do is Yom Superhero, Superhero Day. And so on this Superhero Day, Ariella, who's a bunk counselor, is the accessibility floater. And she's kind of watching to see what's happened, watching to see what problems there might be. And Ariella notices that some kids seem to be having a lot of trouble cutting the fabric. And so she checks in with them and she says, it seems like this is hard. Is there a problem? Is there something you could need? And it turns out that there's this group of kids who are having trouble. And what it turns out is happening is that they're all left-handed. and nobody remembered to bring the left-handed scissors. So maybe the person who was responsible for bringing the art supplies was a bunk counselor in a bunk who doesn't have any left-handed campers. And if there's a designated accessibility planner, that can sometimes catch things like that, like, wait a minute, some of the kids are left-handed and need left-handed scissors. But it doesn't always. So if the planning doesn't catch it, the floating often can. And if somebody's paying attention to it and is designated as someone who can do it, so really the problem becomes easy to solve, because the floater can just find out that the scissors are needed, go get them, and then the kids can cut the fabric. Sometimes there's a more complicated thing. So say there's Sandy, who's a 7th grader who Ariella really doesn't know. She's seen her around but hasn't really directly interacted with her. Sandy's not in Ariella's bunk. But she notices during like cake making, Ariella's sort of like morosely separated from the group, staring at her blank cake, not doing much. And so Ariella goes over and talks to her, and it turns out that Sandy has a lot of problems with her hand, can barely hold a marker, certainly can't draw anything on it, doesn't want to make something that will make her look babyish or stupid to her peers. And so Ariella offers to help. They end up designing it together. Sandy, the camper, is really in charge of what it'll look like, and Ariella helps her by drawing the things she wants on it. And the details of this depend on what the camper wants, what kind of help they welcome. It's negotiated. There's no one solution. But being available and making it known that access is part of somebody's job and that it's okay to need help and to problem solve can really make a big difference. And it's important, don't think of this as extra effort. Think of it as the effort of problem solving and trial and error and support has been made over a very long period of time for kids who are more typical, which means that we've figured out through a lot of time and effort how to make things work for kids who are typical. And we don't have the same received wealth of knowledge, experience, and effort for making things to work for kids who are not typical, who have disabilities. So really, we're not putting in extra effort. We're making a small step towards equality and towards a small step towards creating comparable effort to including meeting the needs of kids who are not typical. So the third role that I think is really important to have in camp, and again, I think this should be designated. I think it works better if it's someone's specifically assigned role and that's what they're doing during the activity. It's the break facilitator. What the break facilitator does specifically is that they're on the lookout for kids who look like they need a break. And they are also, they proactively offer breaks to kids who seem like they need them. They're also a point person. Again, they should be visibly identifiable. Point person who kids who need a break can ask for help getting one. Because often the rules of supervision means that kids can't give themselves breaks, which means that when there's a really legitimate need for breaks, which a lot of people have, if they can't give themselves breaks, we need to be proactive about making it possible for them to get them in another way. The break facilitator also may sometimes, briefly cover for other staff who might suddenly need a break for whatever reason, but mostly it's about watching out for the kids. Other thing the break facilitator does is they, let the access planner and access facilitator know if it seems like there's activities that are causing a consistent problem or there are kids who are having a really hard time. Because there's making it work in the moment, and then there's planning for things that will work, like lahat khila, before the fact. So to give an example of something the break facilitator might do, so say in some bunks they've decided this is a rotating role and they rotate on a daily basis which bunk counselor will be the mealtime break facilitator that day. So Lior, who's on break facilitation rotation today, notices that the singing's getting really loud, and one of his campers, Avi, is covering his ears and looking really miserable. So Lior might say to Avi, hey, Avi, it's really loud in here. You want to go outside for a bit? And so then Avi maybe agrees, and Avi and Lior go sit on the porch for a while until the singing gets a bit less loud. And then, you know, Avi doesn't have a meltdown, isn't in pain, has a positive experience, and it's no big deal. Sometimes people need breaks. Not everyone wants to be surrounded by yelling. And this is a problem that we can solve often very easily by being proactive about it. So to give an example, another example of what the break facilitator role might do. So say the seventh and eighth graders are facing off in a game show night competition activity. Gabriella is this particular activity's break facilitator, and she notices that Alex looks like he's having trouble. So one of the campers, he's, rocking back and forth and covering his face. She's wondering, is he okay? Does he need a break? Gabriella says, Alex, hey, are you having a hard time? Would you like to step out? And Alex says, actually, I don't want to leave. This is what I'm doing so that I can stay in, and I really want to be part of the game show. Gabriella accepts that answer because Alex knows what he needs, gets to decide whether for him in the moment it's more important to participate or more important to get a break from something painful. And she just says, okay, just checking, and if you want a break later, let me know. And afterwards, she'll, check in with the access planner and tell them about, it seems like this room is overloading in some way. Maybe we could talk about how we might arrange it differently from a sensory perspective or figure out what the problem might be. And, sometimes, because sometimes there's no perfect solution, and having kids have agency over figuring out which compromises they want to make and what they want to tolerate and what they don't is really important, because we don't need to override that. We need to respect that, and we need to offer support that's appropriate without being taking over. Okay, so it looks like there's a question. Let me see how I can get to the question. You know what, I'm going to just go to the last slide, and then I'll take questions in the couple of minutes that we have left, because then I can unfull screen it and it'll go smoothly. So, and just one thing to keep in mind is that accessibility is much easier when you budget for it. And sometimes it's less of a resources problem than a planning problem. Don't get me wrong, financial resources limitations are very real. They limit what we can offer. That's a real thing. And it's also the case that every expense that is not anticipated or planned for will seem unsurmountable. And if we assume that there will be accessibility expenses and there's a budget for it, then it means that accessibility is a normal expense rather than an emergency expense. Just like, if we didn't plan for the need to buy enough toilet paper, actually real example, I've seen this happen in camp, then needing more of it could constantly be an emergency. It's not because we can't afford it, it's because we don't, sometimes it's that it's not planned for in a way that's realistic. And I've been trying to find, I don't have good recommendations on what the access budget should be, but one thing to do is just keep careful track of, as the summer progresses, what are you spending money on access-wise, how much is it, and then incorporate access specifically based on that, at least in part, into next year's planning, because we can't get everything right in advance, but we can get more things right in advance every year. So I'm just going to end with the Matan Pledge, because it kind of summarizes the values and the practicality that I'm trying to put into practice. Just that we need to acknowledge that disability is really significant, that we're not trying to make it go away, and that campers with disabilities can do things that are real, and that they're full people with the full range of individuality, perspectives, feelings, and that we're all real. So I'm just going to read off the Matan Pledge, and then I'll take a couple of questions. So I acknowledge that ability, disability, and humanity coexist, and I pledge to see my students, or in this case campers, as they are without downplaying either. will not look past their disabilities. I will instead seek to understand how their disabilities affect their life, learning, and social experiences. I will not overlook their abilities. I will instead actively seek out their abilities and teach them effectively. I will not overlook the humanity of my students. I will remember that they have individual interests and a perspective of their own, and they were each created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God. Okay, so that's the Matan Pledge, and it's something I would encourage you, if you're comfortable, to share with your staff. Now I'm going to look at questions. Okay, so I have seen teens in similar situations rocking back and forth, but when approached asking if they need a break, they are unable to speak or verbalize how they feel. Any recommendations in similar situations? I have a lot of thoughts on communication, and I'll probably do a webinar on it at some point, and I can give you a link to one I did for medical professionals about communication options and ways of showing respect. One thing I'll say now about this is that one method you can use is to ask a two-choice question that's open-ended, like, you know, you look like you might need a break. Am I right that you need a break, or do you need something else right now? So people who can't verbalize often can confirm, like make a good guess, check in with them about the guess, make it easy for them to say whether you're right or wrong. That works with a lot of people who are not highly verbal. And I could go on, it should probably be its own webinar, and I can try and send out some links to some resources about that in a bit. Someone asks, will this webinar be recording so I can share with my staff after? Yes, it's recorded and it'll be sent out, and we'll also put it up later with captions. So I also want to ask about inclusion for kids who are more cognitively delayed than in any of the examples you've given here today. It seems to be a population that we do not usually talk about related to these discussions. Any thoughts on that? That's interesting, because I actually thought that I was thinking about that, but now that I realize, you're right that I wasn't very explicit about that, and it might be worth doing a webinar that's specifically about cognitive impairments, because I do have a lot of thoughts about that. And one of them is that I think that's where planning a range of choices and activities can be crucial, because if all of the activities have the same kind of highly verbal, highly cognitive abstract demands, a lot of kids with cognitive impairments are going to have really unfortunate experiences. Just not to say, if kids with like significant cognitive or intellectual impairments want to participate in things, they have the absolute right. But there need to be options that value other kinds of learning and that don't live in abstraction mode all the time. But again, I'll think about this. I think I'll try and do something that's specifically about this. But you're right, we don't think about that enough, and we really, really need to, because it's important, because they're Jews and they matter and they need to be in our communities. Somebody suggests that cognitively delayed is an ideal language, and that cognitively disabled would be better. I definitely agree with that. I think we need to be willing to talk about disability, because, well, delays are a thing. Not everything's a delay. Some things are permanent. Some things are just how people are in the world, and that's okay. And I think that it's, you know, very important to recognize the maturity and age and development of people who are cognitively different from most people their age. Because there's a really big difference between being 3 years old and being a 9-year-old with a language disability, between being 5 and being an adult with a cognitive disability. But yes, you're right that a webinar to address specifically support for intellectual and other kinds of cognitive disabilities is needed, I'll work on it. And also shoot me an email. I'll send some resources related to that. Okay, so it looks like that's the questions. Looks like that's the time we have for now. Okay, so I asked a really great question. You provided a lot of helpful concrete things to do regarding planning and scheduling that can provide alternative options to intense socialization. But what about FOMO, fear of missing out, force group types of things, where disabled kids will basically be forced to watch everyone around them easily make friends? How can we social situations meaningful for people who will always be sad in them? Okay, so think a couple of things like for that. One is I think that one of the problems with camp is that camp counselors are recruited often primarily from a pool of people who are really socially successful in camp, which can mean that there's not always a lot of knowledge about what things are like for people who are not. So I think recruiting among people who are not from that population, maybe address it better is one thing. I also think that's a reason I advocate for offering periods in which kids can pick activities and change their minds. Because there's less FOMO if you know that you can change your mind and it'll still be there. Because if there's less like artificial scarcity, there's less FOMO. And I think also staff modeling it and not pushing people to do everything can make a difference. And I also think that it is not inherently the case that disabled kids can't have friends. I think it's the case that social situations can work and we need to set them up in ways where we respect who disabled kids are and treat them in a way that makes it clear to everyone that we regard them as people who can make friends. And it seems to me that there's probably a need for another webinar that's specifically about socialization and how to facilitate friendship. So I'll add that to the queue of things to webinar about, but we're over, so we need to stop now. There will be a recording and future webinars. I just now have some new topics for. All right, so thank you, everyone. Okay. So part of a camp experience often involves going out of your comfort zone, trying something new, taking a risk. How do we encourage this? I think the short answer to that is camp is inherently really, really far out of kids' comfort zone, and we don't need to create artificial additional difficulties and pressures. To be continued. To be continued, probably do another one on comfort and emotional development, but now we're over, so thank you everyone, and bye.